cultivating your curiosity really genuinely is a superpower. Someone who's curious is very rarely fearful about the future, because you don't get fearful about what's coming next when you're interested in it. And if action is the antidote to anxiety, I think that curiosity can be the antidote to fear of the future.
I study the patterns of the universe.
Masters to the brain. Virtual your mind. Talking about your life. Fundamental principles.
Philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
Those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Hi there. Welcome to the Think Grow podcast. My name is Ruben Chavez, and I hope you're doing well today. So in this episode, I speak with Chris Williamson, who is the host of a very rapidly growing podcast called Modern Wisdom. And he's got a real big subscriber base as it stands right now. I've been listening to the podcast quite often lately, in fact. He has a lot of insightful guests on there and a lot of prominent figures and really some thoughtful people and some thoughtful conversations. So I'd recommend checking that out if you haven't. And again, that podcast is called Modern Wisdom. And Chris also owns an event company in the UK where he's based. And in addition to all that, he is a coach who helps people get more out of life. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to him about today, is his journey through personal development, because he's struck me in listening to his podcast and in connecting with him on social media. You know, he really struck me as a person who is interested not in the superficial aspects of personal development, but in genuinely developing himself from the bottom up and cultivating all the various dimensions of what it means to be an actualized human or an effective person in the world. And he's figuring it out through his conversations on his podcast and through his own experience. In the conversation we have, we touch on his journey through depression. We talk about how expectations are an important component to emotional regulation. We also talk about how learning about ourselves and our personality from a psychological perspective can be a really effective tool for personal growth. So we cover a range of subjects, and I hope you find this conversation useful. Here is Chris Williamson. I guess, it would be cool to get your take on your background and just kind of give a little summary of yourself and what you've been up to and how you arrived at where you're at right now.
Gotcha, yeah. So for the people who don't know, my name's Chris Williamson. I'm the host of the Modern Wisdom podcast. I'm a club promoter from the United Kingdom. So I've watched 1 million drunk people go in and out of events that I've run over the last 14 years, which is a very unique insight into human behavior, watching drunk people between the hours of like 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. I've been on reality TV a couple of times, blue tick on Twitter, blue tick on Instagram, And after my second trip onto reality TV, that was a show called Love Island, I was living this sort of big name on campus, party boy lifestyle, very classic sort of young, outwardly alpha male life. And after spending some time with people who were built like that, properly built like that, I realized that there was a real discontinuity between who I thought I was and who I genuinely was. I was delivered what I called a fatal dose of contrast. When you're living in a villa surrounded by TV cameras, no friends, no phone, no internet, no books, no distractions, no nothing, no support system, just you and these people. And it was just staring me in the face. Those are the people that you think that you are, and you're not. That's a problem. Problem requires solution. Solution was start to expose myself to introspective, interesting content, do lots of self-inquiry, meditate, journal, expose yourself to more and more content. And then as a part of that, I podcasted a little bit, I guested on shows like this one, and really enjoyed the process. Thought I should do that more. If I want to do it more, the easiest way to do it would be to start a show, and then I can do it as much as I want and no one can tell me otherwise. So I did that, and that was approaching 3 years now. So 2.5 to 3 years, and we just crossed 10 million downloads. And
wow, that's awesome.
I've had James Clear and Robert Greene and Ryan Holiday and Seth Godin and David Epstein and a porn star and like all sorts. I've had everybody on, and I really enjoy it, man. And the trajectory, the corner that I turned when I started to be really sort of truthful to myself was something like really, really powerful. I don't think about it as much as I probably should do, but it was a really like quite sort of profound change in terms of life direction. And that brings me up to right now, sat here talking to you.
So that was the kind of impetus for your change, is when you were on the reality TV show. That was the sticking point for you, is you kind of were faced with these people who you felt were, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but somewhat superficial and maybe going down a path that you didn't want to go down. But at the same time, you kind of identified with some part of them. And so it kind of made you look at yourself in the mirror.
Yeah, I'd say that that's not far off. It was maybe more that these were the people who were the center of the party, center of attention, very, very outgoing, very extroverted. And that was the role that I was playing, because as a club promoter, I was the figurehead of our company. My other business partner was more the admin operations side. So I was the guy on the front door of a nightclub. I've worked 1,000 nights across my career, stood on the front door of 1,000 different club nights. And that was a reinforcement learning experience where the louder I was, the more brash I was, the more I made a name for myself, the more outrageous my statuses were on Facebook. You know, all of this stuff fed back into success for the business and more notoriety for myself. And yeah, I spent some time around people for whom that was their true calling, right? These people had bottomless charisma, endless extroversion, and I was just hopelessly outgunned. I'm like, shit, I thought that was me. And it wasn't like I didn't have a full-blown existential crisis on reality TV, but it was certainly the tip of the spear that kind of set me down that path. Like, not many people go on a dating show and say that it catapulted them towards a life of virtue, but like army of one right here, that's me. So yeah, that's what happened.
That's awesome. I mean, whatever it takes. That's really interesting, man. You strike me as a charismatic dude, you know, and a somewhat extroverted guy. Would you say that you're not extroverted? Would you place yourself more on a different spectrum of that introversion, extroversion scale?
Yeah, I think we need to define the terms and make sure that people know what we're talking about. For me, introversion versus extroversion is to do with where you get your energy from. I get my energy from being on my own. I find it exhausting to be around other people, which means that like starting a business that involved being around thousands of drunkards every night was like a challenge, but a useful one. And charisma and extroversion sometimes and often go together, but not always. You can have people who aren't charismatic but like to be around other people. You'll have that friend who constantly wants to go out for dinner or coffee or whatever it might be. I'm an only child. I spend a lot of time working on my own. I spend a lot of time just doing stuff by hook or by crook, where I end up being in solitude. And I like that. But I can still sort of play the game. And there's a lot of people listening that'll know the same, right? Like when you've got to switch the charisma on and you've got to, you go out for dinner or you're at a wedding or something and you go and you're like, oh, wow, like I am socially capable. But 5 hours later, you're like nudging the partner that you've gone with and you're like, I'm exhausted. I'm totally spent. My tank is just done. And I think that's a really interesting distinction. And I there's less of a judgment about introversion versus extroversion there, because I think people presume that like introversion is some weird version of like social awkward, like non-medical autism or like Asperger's.
Yeah.
Whereas when you think about extroversion, it's more interesting to talk about in terms of energy levels. But yeah, it just reminded me, look, you got to do a bit of self-inquiry and work out what your truth is.
Well, that's a really useful thing to do, man, is to know about. I'm actually discussed personality psychology on this podcast at some length. And so I think my audience is somewhat familiar with the personality traits. And that dimension in particular is really useful. But it is really useful to know yourself, man. It is useful to know your temperament and your particular personality traits, because then you can match your traits to whatever it is you're doing. And in your case, it's like, what am I doing? I'm around a whole bunch of people all day, or all night rather, yet I'm an introvert. That's a mismatch there that you can recognize and then kind of ameliorate somehow. So that's a really useful thing to know. In fact, I don't know, I've come to the view that personal development is largely about kind of understanding your particular personality traits and then knowing which ones you need to develop more. You know, I mean, it's a very literal view of personal development. That's one way to conceptualize it. like you mentioned that you can be an introvert, but turn on the extroversion, right? So it's really useful to have that toolkit. Like, yes, you have your particular temperament, but also you can switch into a different mode and you can kind of cultivate that opposite trait when need be. I was going to ask you, you're having this realization, right? You're having this realization at your time in the reality TV show. I'm wondering, what was kind of your first entry point into the world of quote unquote personal development once you realized you wanted to kind of go down that path? Was it a book or was it a podcast?
Yeah, it was Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan, the first one. It's 2016-ish, maybe start of 2016, something like that. And very quickly, the same kind of, I guess, bro academics that are popular on the internet. So the Ben Shapiro's of this world, the Sam Harris's, the Gabor Mate's, you just tumble down that particular rabbit hole. And I've got a lot of affinity still for all of those guys. I still listen to a lot of Ben and Sam. So yeah, it was that. And the reason that I like Jordan Peterson was he was the first person that told me that telling the truth is the most important thing that you can do in life. And very much what I'd realized was, as a young guy without much of a sense of identity, I'd very quickly attached my sense of identity to my accomplishments. We saw success with the business. I then attached my sense of self-worth to the success of the business. I then saw myself as almost being this kind of meta personality for the company. I had to be the role model that was the leader of the company as opposed to be me that was the leader of the company. And yeah, it turned out, man, like I'd covered over an awful lot of what I genuinely cared about in life, so much that if you asked me in my opinion on something, do you like that movie? I'd go like, yes. And I'd wait for your response because I'd only want to say what I thought you wanted me to say.
Yeah.
That's what my goal was, to be as just liked as possible. And I think that stemmed from sort of like quite a fundamental lack of confidence in me being who I was and people liking me for that. And this quote from Alain de Botton, the guy behind the School of Life, where he says, loneliness is a kind of tax we have to pay to atone for a certain complexity of mind. And I really love that because it reminds me that the weirder you are and the more non-typical your interests are, the fewer people you will find that are like you. And it's given the choice between honesty and acceptability, most of us will choose the latter.
Yeah.
We want to be accepted by the tribe. We want to nerf the weird edges of what we do.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest realizations over the past 5 years of doing a lot of this self-inquiry and speaking to interesting people has been that your weirdness is your competitive advantage.
Yep.
No one can beat you at being you. And therefore, all of the different quirks and scars and traumas and ways that you've dealt with things and that weird, funny lisp that you've got and the fact that you're really bad with your left hand and like all of that, everything that you have that makes up you is impossible to compete with because no one else has that particular combination. And as soon as I started to see my uniqueness and my quirks as competitive advantages rather than social weaknesses, that made a big impact on me.
That's very interesting. So I want to go back to this thing you said about being, the way I remember it, is being too high in agreeableness, right? That's another personality trait. It's like this agreeableness dimension of a personality where you're basically looking for approval or looking for other people's reactions in order to kind of gauge your own truth in a sense. How did you, because I assume now, and just through my observation and just kind of hearing you and watching you interact with people, it seems as though you have increased your assertiveness. You've increased your confidence from that description, at least from the description you just gave. You're not looking for approval. Is that a fair assessment, first of all?
Absolutely. I mean, the elephant in the room with that is I'm 4th percentile in agreeableness. So I'm wildly disagreeable.
Hilarious.
I'm like more disagreeable than the 96 people that would come before me.
Okay. That's interesting.
I'd nerfed. So that's a perfect example. That's an explicit example of how I'd changed a particular part of me.
Yeah. And that's what I'm curious about, actually. I was wondering if you know some of the things that you did to do that, because that's actually one of the biggest things. I think I've heard Peterson talk about the fact that in clinical psychology, there are 2 primary things that work on. You work on negative emotionality, which is neuroticism, and kind of lowering that. And then you work on assertiveness training for many people. And anyway, I'm just wondering how that ties into what you were, what you experienced in your journey and what you did to increase your confidence, your assertiveness, whatever it is, however you want to frame it.
I think it was more removing blockages. So it wasn't that I needed to make myself more assertive. I was already very assertive. I'm incredibly low in agreeableness, but very high in compassion and also very low in politeness, which makes for like an interesting mix when we're out for dinner. So I'm always like very kind of blunt with the server. Like I'll leave a tip, but I'll always be like, can we just have this or that or the other? And my friends kind of always make a joke about it. Being honest, man, there wasn't any kind of super trick to that. It wasn't me working on my assertiveness. I already was very assertive. It's just that I was just hopelessly unconfident in my own inner truth. I didn't know what it was. I'd compromised it so much. And then it was kind of a little bit like the floodgates opened. And now, I talk 5 hours, 6 hours a week about the transhumanism movement or about what the nature of consciousness is or about whether we can message extraterrestrial, whatever it is. I'll talk about something shamelessly interested and curious about whatever's going to go on. And yeah, a lot of it was removing blockages. And there might be a lot of people listening who think the same, especially as you get through your 20s and you kind of start to cast off the young adult that you were and you start to think, right, okay, like that was fun and I've played that game, but like who am I going to be?
Yeah.
I want to actually form a concrete sense of identity that will be the foundation for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And I'm incredibly, incredibly glad that I had made that change because I would have a lot of work to do if I'd compounded for another 5 years going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Could you say more about the blockages that you kind of were keeping you from speaking your truth or being more in touch with that part of yourself?
It was hopeless on confidence, man. So again, a lot of my interests were non-typical. I wanted people to like me. I was quite unpopular at school, and thankfully that didn't cause too many problems academically. Went to uni, did a bachelor's, did a master's, played cricket for England, did a bunch of other stuff. But still, I think that there was a big desire for me just to be wanted and liked by people because I'd never had that. I'm an only child who hadn't had the support structure of siblings that have always got your corner.
Yeah.
And I went to school where I was kind of unpopular. And then I came out and I was a club promoter who we found success very quickly. Like within a year, I owned my own franchise and was doing thousands of people and they knew my name and they needed me.
Wow.
They needed me because they needed guest lists. They needed to get in the VIP. They needed to know who that pretty girl was over there. And I was like, shit, this is it. I've made it. I'm needed. I'm wanted by people.
Right.
And it wasn't that. That wasn't what it was. It was a transactional relationship and I couldn't see it for what it was. And it took me, like 8 years of working in that industry, 8 or 9 years of working in that industry to think, yeah, no, this isn't you actualizing your inner logos. This is you being what other people need you to be. And in that environment, when you're surrounded by fantastic people who are very talented, but like partying and drinking, trying to bring up, have you heard of the Fermi Paradox? Or like, do you know what what the state of consciousness is? Or do you know how many like 10 to the 100th powers years it's going to be before the heat death of the universe? Like, you can't have that conversation. So you continue to nerf the edges of the stuff that you're interested in. And a big part of that has been enabled by finding content that I resonated with online. And I think this is one of the beautiful advantages that the internet, for all of the problems, I have huge problems with the technocracy that we have and overuse of social media and stuff like that. But it permits people to find others like them who have their very particular quirk on the internet, and it helps them feel less alone. If you love Dungeons and Dragons, this particular volume of this thing, there will be a Reddit thread filled with people just like you.
Yep. And
if you love fantasy hockey leagues or something like that for Venezuela, you will be able to find, like everything. There's something for everyone. And very much I found people talking my language, and I realized, intellectual curiosity isn't something to be embarrassed about, even though it wasn't something that's celebrated in the nightclub world. Like, who knew? But yeah, it it was nice to find that, and it finally sort of felt like I'd embraced something that I'd been pushing down for a long time.
So it sounds like that the way that you kind of were able to connect with your inner truth was, it seems like that intellectual curiosity was latent within you on some level, and you finding the people who were talking about things that kind of sparked that curiosity, that gave you permission to then kind of be more of who you are.
Hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Hit the nail on the head.
That makes sense. I really resonate with that also, man. I think that's a huge deal, to find your intellectual tribe, finding people who like to, and not people necessarily who think the things you think, but who think in ways that you find compelling, and who have views whom maybe you disagree with, but who articulate those views in ways that you can resonate with and you can understand and you can respect, I mean, I was exposed to personal development in like when I was 18 years old. I'm 35 now, and I came across like books like Think and Grow Rich and, all those kind of classic self-help books. I read them and they had a particular impact on me. They sent me down a path. So that was really good. But when I came across the thinkers that you mentioned, Jordan Peterson, the Ben Shapiro's, the Gabor Mate's, finding those people really helped me articulate more of the ideas that I wanted to articulate. And I had a brain-assance of sorts. And so I'm glad that you said that, because that's a big part, I think, of of connecting with who you are, finding someone else who is saying the things that you're thinking on some level, but can't quite put out there into the world.
100%, man. I wonder how many other people have got that. I would venture an awful lot. And I think a big part of the unspoken, like, elephant in the room, and the quiet part that no one's saying out loud about the IDW movement that was probably peaked around 2018 was that it made being intellectually curious cool.
Yep, that's exactly right.
That was the biggest paradigm shift that it had. It wasn't about, because they don't agree. All the guys, Ben Shapiro's a Jew, Jordan Peterson's kind of like semi-Christian, Sam Harris is an atheist, like Joe Rogan's a mixed martial arts fighting, gun-toting liberal.
Yep.
Like Ben Shapiro's wildly conservative.
Right.
Brett Weinstein's like wildly liberal, and Eric Weinstein's a polymath, like, genius guy. You know what I mean? Like, none of these people have the same views. What is the unifying thread? It's a passion for intellectual curiosity. It's the fact that they hold virtue and truth and integrity fairly high, not always totally Snow White, but I think it's about as close as you're going to get on the internet. And they're rigorous and precise with their speech. And all of those things compiled together with a little bit of clout on the internet makes for one hell of a neutron star to suck everybody else into,
Totally. You said that very well. Hey there, just wanted to take a quick moment to let you know about one of our sponsors for this show, KiwiCo. Really excited to partner with this company. If you have kids, or if you're a kid at heart and just want to spark your curiosity and kindle your creative thinking, you might want to listen up. As many of you know, my wife and I had our first child in 2019, and this kid just has an insatiable curiosity. He's always hungry to learn, so naturally we're always on the lookout for companies that can help us give him the cognitive stimulation that he wants and needs. And KiwiCo has come in really handy for this. They deliver hands-on science and art projects for kids of all ages, 0 to 104. You can engineer a walking robot, conduct bubbling chemistry experiments, or design a paint pendulum. All sorts of different activities to choose from. We recently received a crate that our little guy loves and has been playing with joyfully for the past several days. He's almost 2, so this particular crate had counting activities and some hide-and-seek activities that he really seemed to enjoy. One of the things my wife and I love about the crates that KiwiCo sends is that they're all analog projects. And this means our little guy really needs to be actively engaged in order to interact with it. And that's really important to us. And they're also really pretty. They're aesthetically pleasing. They have kind of an old school vibe to them, kind of like they were made in Santa's workshop, often out of wood and other sustainable materials, which we really like too. So this is a great gift for the holidays, and especially at this time when parents and kids alike are spending more time at home, it's a great way to add some variety. KiwiCo is redefining learning with hands-on projects that build confidence, creativity, and critical thinking skills. There's something for every kid or kid at heart at KiwiCo. Get 50% off your first month plus free shipping on any crate line with code TGP at KiwiCo. That's 50% off your first month at KIWICO.com. Promo code TGP. I also listened to an episode where you were talking about some of your experiences with depression, and I was curious about that too. If you had those experiences before your reality TV show kind of foray, or if that came along afterward once you became a little bit more self-aware and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they've kind of been an ongoing thread. I'm not sure whether I agree with the black dog follows you around for the rest of your life mentality to do with depression. I don't actually necessarily think that that's true, but certainly there was periods between 2012, when I was about 22 until probably about 27, 28, where it got, there was periods where I'd be bad. I wasn't someone who was chronically depressed, but I would have depressive periods. And looking back, man, like I realized this whilst listening to Orlando Botton in London. I realized that I'd basically had miniature breakdowns that I'd caused myself from overwork. So I would go and I would work until, like, stupid hours, obviously, club promoting. I would go and work until 6 a.m, then get up and feel guilty that it was midday and I'd not done any work. So I'd get up and I'd do my work and I'd do my work and I'd do. And then something in me would just snap and I'd be in bed, catatonic, like unprepared to even, like, couldn't be bothered, like ordering Deliveroo and Uber Eats because I couldn't be bothered to go get food and blah, 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 which obviously is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then after a couple of days, I'd kind of fix it. And that was just this kind of ongoing little thread here and there. Now, being honest, I wish that I could say that doing the self-inquiry fixed that overnight, but it really didn't. And I would actually say that in some ways it made me more conscious of some of the shortcomings in life. They say that true hell is when the person that you are meets the person you could have been. And when you realize the person that you could be is so much greater than the person that you are, because you're not actualizing yourself by going out and sleeping with like 3 girls a week, or being the biggest club promoter in some city with a couple of million people in that no one gives a fuck about. Like, as soon as you realize, oh, hang on, all of this scaffolding that I'd bolstered my sense of self-worth with actually is for nothing, you got to start again. So again, didn't encounter a full-on existential crisis, but there's been a couple of times where I've been like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, why am I, what is happening here? And yeah, I would say that now my ability to deal with the thoughts that come up in my head, very, very heavily assisted by evolutionary psychology, bizarrely, which most people would think of as a very sort of transactional, brute force solution to something like this. But just realizing that I'm not my thoughts, I'm the person who hears them. Like, that's one of the most fundamental realizations, I think. And to anyone who's has depressive episodes that is listening, like, you are not the voice in your head that speaks. You're the one that hears it speak. I know this sounds so bizarre because we decide to identify with those words, but they're not us. They are not us. It's the same as the words that are coming out of my mouth. You don't know what you're going to think next. You don't know what I'm going to say next. Treat them as the same thing. And upon realizing that, which is what's the purpose of consciousness? Is it so that we can project, or we can better expect what other people think, therefore we can be better acting social creatures? Is it because it allows us to do foreplanning so that we don't have to put our hand in the fire? We can predict what would happen if we put our hand in the fire. Is it blah, 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 blah? But all of those things, none of them are like, I am my thoughts. It is some source of truth. And very, very quickly, that made a big difference. So I would say 2020 in terms of mood, despite the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic, despite the fact that I ruptured my Achilles and have been essentially disabled for like the last 3 months, I would say that this has been the year that I've been most robust. Overall, my mood has been the best. Happiness and gratitude and insight and all the rest of it is getting like linearly or maybe even exponentially better. And for a long time, it didn't feel like that was going to be the case. So, there is hope for people who think that they're kind of going to be constantly stuck in this cycle of okay to a bit shit, just vacillating between those two things every 6 months or so. Yeah, there is, with enough work and with a support structure, there is a way out.
Was there a particular book or, lecture, anything like that kind of really helped you break through and internalize that idea that you are not your thoughts, you're the one who hears them?
I really think that I could have done my self-development journey a lot more efficiently. Like, it was so brute forced, man. Like, just sheer weight of content and exposure, and I wasn't taking notes, and I'd have to watch things like 5 times.
I totally relate to that.
To get, watching the same Sam Harris on Joe Rogan like 3 times, not taking a single note, and being like, oh, that's a mic drop moment, and then tomorrow forgetting it.
You're speaking my language, man. I'm with you. I relate to you.
I always want to have the external brain, Tiago Forte, personal knowledge management like thing down, but I just Evernote's not my bag. And, anyway, so there wasn't anything in particular. If people are interested in evolutionary psychology, The Moral Animal by Robert Wright will take your head off.
Yeah.
It is unbelievable. It's just, every paragraph is a mic drop. You'll constantly be sending photos of pages to your friends, which is usually a pretty good sign of a book. And Sam Harris, a lot of Sam Harris's stuff, like, he's a very, very insightful guy. His lecture on the meaning of life, or the shortness of life, I think it is, which has then been clipped into about a 10-minute meditation with music behind it. That, I must listen to that like once a month. I listened to it on the way into my ankle operation because I was nervous about going under the knife. So, like, I think finding anything that speaks to you and just listen to the people who understand the way that the brain works, right? But Sam Harris's books on the meaning of life was definitely one of them.
He's quite a articulate and illuminating teacher, I would say, in terms of spirituality, partly because he's so precise with his words and with the way he presents concepts. So I fully endorse that idea, man. I think that's a really useful way to conceptualize kind of your thoughts. You're not your thoughts, you are the thing that hears them. And that's an age-old truth. That's something that's been passed down through Eastern, philosophy all the way since the Buddha. And it's something that I think it's now mainstream, people are getting it, people are understanding it. And one of my things that I've had kind of a recent awakening, because I'm a kind of a cerebral person, and one of my fears, though, is that people will intellectualize this, and people do intellectualize. I intellectualized this for a while. It's like you can know something without really like downloading it into your nervous system, is how I like to think about it. And one of the things that I recently kind of realized is that, and this may sound trite, but it is, I'm still working on articulating it in a way that is useful for people. But I think in relation to what you're saying, the key to life is something like the ability to face and experience discomfort. Because like a lot of our problems, I think, and I would like to hear your take on this, a lot of our problems, a lot of our depression, a lot of our anxiety, a lot of our suffering in general, I think comes from us trying to resist the discomfort. Whereas if we were open to feeling the discomfort, open to observing the thoughts that are passing through our consciousness that are negative, open to experiencing the uncomfortable physical sensations that are associated with negative emotions, open to experiencing all forms of discomfort, we would find that we suffer less, and we just experience the raw emotion or the raw thought, as opposed to layering stories on top of that thought. And so, of course, this has all been said, but my point is that the micro skill there, the skill at the center of all of that, is the ability to experience discomfort and kind of tolerate discomfort. And so that's kind of been my thing lately. I've been really practicing experiencing discomfort. And I find that, like you, these past few months have been a massive breakthrough for me. My mood and my emotional resilience have been through the roof. I've just felt much more at peace and everything like that. So I'd like to hear your take on that rambling.
But congratulations, man. I'm really happy for you. It's bizarre. Like 2020's been bad for a lot of things, but I think it's been good for personal growth and mustaches. It's been good for personal growth and mustaches. Yeah, that's the key insight, or one of the key insights from waking up. I think that framing is everything. And this is why people who see life as a game have such an advantage over those that don't. Now, I take things seriously. I read serious stuff. I speak to serious people. I laugh a lot, but I wouldn't naturally say I'm like a giggly sort of laughable, happy person, at least not by nature. But you're right. If you see the thoughts that arise in your mind, if you don't attach yourself to them, a Sam Harrisism, try and stay angry for longer than 5 minutes whilst not thinking about your anger.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
You can't do it. The reason that the anger stays there is because you continue to ruminate about the fact that you're angry. Then you get angry at yourself for being angry.
Yeah.
Then you think about the situation again and the whole cycle restarts. Like when you let go of that, that's a big part of it. Another element here is that it would appear neurologically, evolutionarily, we're not pleasure seeking, we're simply pain avoiding. All that we do is avoid pain, and any seeking of pleasure can be seen as an increasing gradation away from pain. That pleasure is not pleasure itself, it's simply an increasing absence of pain. Another part, you mentioned Eastern philosophy, so life is suffering, which is the Buddha quote, but as with all quotes that have been translated from ancient languages, some scholars contest what it means, and the word is dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, and that's the word for suffering in one particular translation. However, some scholars contest that word is unsatisfactoriness. Life is unsatisfactoriness. And if you see things in that way, that you can dream about the perfect holiday you're going to have, but when you get there, the chair leg's a little bit wobbly, and there could be a bit more ice in this drink, and I've got some sand between my toes, and that's it. That is the experience of life. Yep. The experience of life, sadly, is one of the prongs of your fork being slightly out on a Michelin star meal. That is what you're going to notice, because you are wired to notice that stuff. Yep. And to kind of loop it all back, a great book for people who want an easy read about kind of leaning into discomfort is Chasing Excellence by Ben Bergeron, who is an Ironman triathlete and coach of some of the fittest CrossFit athletes on the planet. And he talks very much about leaning into discomfort as if you invited it through the door. That's what he says. And I'll finish off kind of one thing that you linked to there, which is a Sam Harrisism, where he talks about framing. And you were saying about, like, if you just see something as a challenge to be overcome or an experience to be had, that can change everything. A perfect example of that Sam uses, which is really great, is you're in the gym, you're in the middle of a hard workout, you're sweating, you're hot, you're breathing heavy, you've got that tunnel vision going on, you've got the metal taste in the back of your throat. Like, it's bad, but there's an odd sense of satisfaction. That's what you're there for, right?
Right.
When you're in the gym, you think this is what I'm here for. This is why I'm here. If you were to feel all of those sensations spontaneously when you were driving your car, you would think that you were having a stroke or a heart attack or something
right.
terrible is going on.
Yep.
But objectively, it's the exact same sensation. So what's going on? Everything is framing. Everything is how you frame the situation. And my favorite video, everyone should go and watch it. If you just Google Rick and Morty Game of Roy, and it's Morty goes into a virtual reality game that he doesn't realize as this particular character called Roy, and he lives a life, and he goes through this entire thing and basically makes a bunch of mistakes and lives a whole life in the space of like 2 minutes. And when he comes out, the point is, life is just this game. It simply is. And the more that you can see it as that, the more that you can see it as the equanimity game, as Marcus Aurelius called it, like, how quickly can we get back on the horse? How quickly can we, okay, something's happened. Same with me with my Achilles. Ruptured in Achilles means that I'm not going to have full athletic function in my right foot. Like, athletics and training is a big part of my life. I'm not going to be able to do everything fully for a year. Okay, like, that's a challenge. Let's see what I can do with it. And I'm not some paragon of perfect stoic virtue, but I certainly know that I would be 100 times worse if I didn't have these tools in my toolkit. And the final thing that I would give, I'm just sort of pulling out random stuff from different episodes I've done. A guy called Corey Allen, who's a meditation coach, and the guy that does Aubrey Marcus's meditation courses, he has something which he calls the mindfulness gap. And the mindfulness gap is a moment in between stimulus and response that we give ourselves to consider how we choose to respond. You could see it as the dichotomy of control from Stoicism. You could see it as System 1, System 2 from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It manifests in a bunch of different ways, but just cultivating that mindfulness gap. Something has happened and I respond. That 1 second, that second feels like a lifetime, but that's probably been one of the biggest discoveries that I've made. I can just have that second to consider, okay, That's interesting.
Yep.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And if you stay curious about what's coming next, you tend to not be in that much fear about what's going to happen.
Yes, and that second right there, that's like the pause. That's in Radical Acceptance. Tara Brach, she talks about practice the pause, and that is so useful because that is the discomfort right there. If you're able to just kind of make it through that discomfort without reacting so quickly, you can respond from a place of equanimity. That is a very, very useful thing to know. And in a sense, that's kind of what meditation is for. I think it's like you're practicing that response. You're practicing a controlled response. You're basically tempering your fight or flight response. It's analogous to the gym. You go to the gym so that you work out. You set aside time to work out so that in your general life, you're stronger and more fit. Well, in the same way, you set aside time to meditate or do some kind of mindfulness practice so that in your general life, you are less reactive and your response is more controlled, right? So that's a really useful thing. Also, in terms of framing, I think that is synonymous with how I think of it, which is a lot of our mood and our happiness is dependent, and well-being is dependent upon our expectations. If we expect life to be full of unending positive emotions, we will be sorely disappointed. And it sounds so silly and trite, but it is so useful to modulate your expectations and know that, as the Buddhists say, life is unsatisfactoriness. And if you go in with that expectations, things actually are much, much better because it is contrary to mainstream self-help in a sense. And I think it's changing, but I think the old school self-help is like positive, positive, positive. But if you actually flip that around and it's like, oh, I expect to, like Marcus Aurelius says, I expect to encounter irrational imbeciles today. Like, you won't be as bothered once you do. And so that's a really useful thing to know.
The Naval Ravikant quote, desire is a contract you make with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want.
Yep.
Yeah, man. I mean, that very, very much is. And this is another thing why I keep on talking about curiosity being the most important personality trait of the 21st century. I really do think that someone who's curious is very rarely fearful about the future because you don't get fearful about what's coming next when you're interested in it. And that's something that I've drilled myself to do. I think everyone finds a couple of little sort of maxims or aphorisms that really speak to them. James Altuch has got this one that he calls not useful, which is a labeling process for when he has a thought which he doesn't want. And he just says, like, labels it not useful. Like that guy from Bridge of Spies, the Russian dude where he's like, would it help? Like that guy from Bridge of Spies, that's the same thing he's got. He's got, would this bad thought help me? And mine is, that's interesting. So something will occur. I'll rupture an Achilles. Like, okay, at the time I was panicking a little bit, but there was part of me that was thinking, this is going to be interesting. I've never had an operation before. I've never broken a bone before. I've never done this before. You find that you've been invited to do a talk at work and you've got one day to prepare and all the directors are going to be there. That's interesting. Like, what's the next 24 hours going to be like? I'm going to make some memories. This is going to be really cool. So cultivating your curiosity really genuinely is a superpower. And if action is the antidote to anxiety, I think that curiosity can be the antidote to fear of the future.
I love that. I was going to say one more thing to add on to your expectations, to your framing analogy. It's like, yes, everything is framing and challenges are a really useful thing. In fact, that may be the only way that we're existing is because we have limitations and because we have challenges. And so if we can expect them, then all the more power to us. You mentioned the gym and I would say, yes, we go to the gym because we want the challenge. We want the resistance because that's the only way that we can progress. And in the same way, the only reason we play video games, for example, is because we know there will be challenges in the video game that we have to overcome. And that's like your Rick and Morty thing. It's like the only reason we're in life, in the game of life, potentially, this is a metaphysical claim, but potentially the only reason we're in the game of life is to experience the challenges that we can overcome and progress and kind of step our way through life in that fashion by overcoming those challenges. So that may be the fundamental reality of life, is that it's just challenges, and that's kind of what we have to deal with. That's what defines the structure of our life, and not the other way around, which I think how most people think, which is life should be dandy and peachy and we should have this rainbow and sunshine. But no, it's actually not like that. It can be more like that though if you accept the difficulty inherent in life, I think, though.
I agree, man.
Paradoxically. Yeah.
I agree.
Whew. Glad I got that out of my system. My therapist. My gosh. I really appreciate the perspectives, man. And I think that people are going to get a lot of value from listening to your story and the journey and some of the tacks that you've taken to your personal development.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate that. It's an interesting world at the moment. I genuinely think that I'm hopeful for the future. There's, on a macro level, we've got some concerns going on. But on an individual level, I think people are being liberated to understand their own desires, to carve their own path in life, to be able to find, on a more micro level, like a individual group level, to find people that they resonate with. And that makes me really, really hopeful for the future. As someone that felt quite lonely for a long time, that really does make me feel good.
I completely agree with that. I think that it is a very, very interesting time. And I think it's breeding a lot of people who like us and others like us who are trying to understand the world and trying to work on themselves such that they can be in the world in an effective manner. And I think that's spreading more quickly than we think. So thank you, man, for sharing your truth. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, man. I can't wait to be back.
Hey, thanks for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes on my website at thinkgrowprosper.com/podcast. That's where I put all the links and resources mentioned in each episode. It's also where I put the outlines of topics covered, which is a really good way to refer back to episodes in the future. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to leave a review on iTunes with your biggest takeaway. I make it a point to read all the reviews. You can also screenshot this episode and share it to your social media along with something you learned or found interesting. And tag me in your post because I'd love to see what you found interesting. Say hi and thank you for your support.